You may not believe in messages like angels are sending you a sign. For many people who have already gone through several chapters of emotional experience, that reaction is completely understandable. After experiencing enough in relationships, people often become less willing to believe in promises about a special kind of love. However, Carl Jung pointed out something quite remarkable. In the psychological life of human beings, some encounters are not entirely accidental. Sometimes, a person enters our life at the exact moment when something within us is beginning to change, and their presence reveals parts of ourselves that we had never clearly seen before. What is interesting is that encounters like this rarely happen in the way we expect. Sometimes the person who appears is noticeably younger than you. This can easily make many people feel confused, or even dismiss the possibility from the very beginning. Yet from Jung's perspective, unusual connections like this often carry a deeper psychological meaning. They are not only about romance, they are also connected to the idea that some part of you is entering a new stage of development. In this video, we will take a closer look at a possibility that many people dismiss too quickly. Why a younger person might appear at the very moment when you believe you already understand love quite well. Why such a connection can bring an experience completely different from anything you have known before. And more importantly, how to recognize whether this is simply an ordinary coincidence or a meeting that holds genuine meaning within your psychological journey, in the way Jung once described. Part 1. An old chapter in your love life is ending. Before we talk about the person who may enter your life, there is something that needs to be faced directly. Real movements in emotional life rarely begin from the outside. They usually begin with a quiet shift inside your own psychological structure. From the outside, nothing may look dramatically different yet, but internally, something is no longer operating the way it used to. The kinds of connections that once felt acceptable begin to feel harder to maintain. This does not happen because you suddenly became more demanding, but because a deeper part of you has quietly changed its standard for what feels true inside a relationship. Many people spend years inside relationships where their main task is to keep things stable. They learn how to behave appropriately, respond at the right moments, and maintain a calm emotional atmosphere. But if they look more carefully, they often realize they have been loving through an edited version of themselves. Jung called this the persona. Persona is not false in the ordinary sense. It is the way human beings adapt to be accepted. In emotional life, persona often appears in very familiar forms. Some people always take the role of the understanding one. Some constantly keep themselves composed. Others quietly train themselves not to need too much attention, so they will not make the other person uncomfortable. From the outside, all of this looks reasonable, but Jung repeatedly reminded us that every persona comes with a cost. The cost is that a part of the real self is pushed down into the darker layers of the psyche. That hidden part is what he called the shadow. In the context of relationships, the shadow often holds very simple but very real needs. The need to be seen completely, the need to be loved without performing a role, and the need to sit next to someone without monitoring every emotional reaction. The problem is not that the persona exists. The real problem is that many people live inside their persona for so long that they forget they are wearing it. They begin to believe that the way they love is simply who they truly are. But the human psyche never stays completely silent when a part of the self has been neglected for too long. At some point, signals begin to appear. They rarely arrive as dramatic events. More often, they appear as a subtle but persistent sense of discomfort. There may be conversations that continue as usual, yet you feel they never touch anything truly important. There may be relationships that look perfectly stable from the outside, yet internally, you feel as if you are standing slightly outside your own life. There may even be moments when you suddenly realize you have played the role of the mature one, the understanding one, or the one who does not cause problems for so long that you cannot remember the last time you spoke honestly about what you actually feel. Jung saw these moments as signs of a very important psychological process. He once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When the unconscious remains unrecognized, it quietly directs the course of your life while you assume it is simply destiny." This is true in love as well. When a person has not yet become aware of the parts of themselves that have been pushed down, they will keep entering the same kinds of relationships without understanding why. But once awareness begins, something very interesting happens. Old patterns stop functioning smoothly. Things that once felt acceptable start to feel strangely uncomfortable. This does not occur because other people suddenly changed. It happens because the psychological structure inside you has entered a different stage. Jung described this process as part of individuation, the gradual movement toward becoming who you truly are. And during this process, many old structures must begin to crack before a new form of life can emerge. This is why an old phase in emotional life often comes to an end before a different kind of connection can appear. When your psyche has developed into a deeper level, relationships that operate only on the surface begin to feel insufficient. You may still maintain them for a while, but the sense of misalignment becomes more and more noticeable. It is similar to an adult sitting again in an old school chair. The chair itself is not wrong, but your body no longer belongs in that size. Many people mistake this stage for emotional pessimism. They assume they are losing faith in love, but in many cases, that is not what is actually happening. What is changing is your inner standard. Your psyche begins to reject the kinds of connections you once tolerated simply to keep a relationship functioning. It is precisely at this point that an old chapter truly begins to close. Not through a dramatic announcement, not through a single intense event. It closes through a quiet but unmistakable realization that you no longer want to love in the old way. You no longer want to appear in a relationship only through your persona. You begin to want a kind of encounter where the deeper, unedited part of you can actually exist. And what is interesting is that when an old psychological structure truly reaches its limit, the psyche often begins preparing for a different kind of meeting. It is not accidental that many people only encounter a truly transformative connection after they have gone through a long period of feeling that the old patterns no longer fit. If the previous chapter has not fully reached its limit, you simply would not have the sensitivity required to recognize the difference when something genuinely new appears. In the next part, we will explore a question that surprises many people when viewed through Jung's lens. Why, in many cases, when an old emotional chapter quietly closes, the person who appears next is not the type you previously imagined at all, but someone younger than you, and why that very difference can sometimes be a signal that your psyche is moving toward an entirely different kind of connection. If you want to understand this more deeply, stay with the next section, because what Jung suggested about encounters like this may change the way you interpret several experiences in your own life. Part 2. Why a younger person is entering your path. To understand why a younger person might appear at this particular stage of your life, the issue needs to be viewed the way Jung often viewed relationships, not merely as a social event, but as a movement within the deeper structure of the psyche. Jung believed that human beings do not live only through consciousness, the rational part that thinks it knows what it wants. Much of our psychological life is guided by the unconscious, the place where unused potentials, hidden traits, and unexpressed energies remain. When someone spends many years living within roles, responsibilities, and stable patterns, conscious life often becomes heavier, more rigid, and more inclined to repeat familiar choices. Yet the psyche is not a static system. It continually seeks to restore balance. When consciousness becomes too rigid, the unconscious often begins introducing new elements into life to break that rigidity. In many cases, that element does not appear as a new idea or a new plan. It appears as a person. And what is striking is that this person often carries a psychological quality very different from the structure of life you have become used to. When Jung speaks of a younger person, he would not look only at biological age. He would look at the kind of energy that person brings with them. Youth here is not merely about being younger in years. It also refers to a psychological state that has not yet been frozen by too many layers of defense. A younger person often lives closer to the immediacy of experience. They are not yet fully organized by the defensive strategies that older individuals tend to develop after years of collisions with life. This gives their way of feeling and responding to the world a certain directness. When someone who has lived for many years within a stable psychological structure meets a person who carries that kind of energy, the inner reaction is often very distinctive. It does not happen because they are superficially seeking novelty. Something deeper takes place. A part of the psyche recognizes something it has lost. It is similar to the moment when you step into an old room and suddenly hear a melody you have not heard in years. You were not searching for it, but when it appears, a whole field of memory and feeling wakes up inside you. In Jung's symbolic language, the younger person sometimes functions as a kind of messenger of the unconscious, someone who carries signals from a part of psychological life that consciousness has forgotten. This helps explain why many people feel something unusual when they meet someone younger. On the surface, the connection may not seem entirely reasonable according to their usual standards. The two individuals may not be at the same stage of life. Their ways of seeing the world may differ. Yet, at the same time, there can be a quiet sense that the presence of this person alters the psychological atmosphere around them. Conversations begin to feel more alive. Small moments in daily life regain meaning. Some people describe this feeling as reopening a window in a room that has been closed for a long time. The room itself was never the problem. It simply lacked air. What needs to be understood here is that, in Jungian logic, attraction between two people rarely arises only from criteria established by consciousness. Many people believe they are searching for someone who fits their type. Yet in reality, many of the deepest relationships begin with a kind of pull that reason cannot initially explain. Jung explained this by saying that the psyche constantly seeks wholeness. When a part of yourself has not been lived, the unconscious tends to draw you toward people who carry the energy you are missing. For this reason, the person who enters your life may not resemble the image you once imagined. They may feel more like a correction emerging from within the psyche than a choice you carefully planned. On a practical level, this also carries a very concrete meaning. A younger person may enter your life as a relationship that forces you to reconsider long-held assumptions about what love is supposed to look like. Many people grow up with a clear picture of what a proper relationship should be, balanced in age, similar in circumstances, aligned with social expectations. Those standards are not inherently wrong. They help society maintain order. Yet the psychological life of an individual does not always move according to such rational diagrams. Sometimes, a meaningful relationship appears precisely where consciousness never expected it. However, this also needs to be approached with clarity. The appearance of a younger person in your life does not automatically mean the relationship is right. Jung never encouraged people to blindly follow unconscious impulses. What truly matters is the quality of the connection. If the relationship contains respect, sincerity, and the possibility of growth for both people, then the difference in age gradually becomes secondary. In many cases, the true value of a relationship is not determined by whether it fits external standards, but by whether it allows both individuals to live more truthfully with themselves. And perhaps this is the deepest point within this motif. A younger person does not always appear in your life to make you younger again. That is a very superficial interpretation. In many cases, they appear as a force of awakening. They touch a part of your life that has been covered by the dust of old disappointments, long responsibilities, and roles you have carried for too long. When that part begins to wake up, you may realize that your life still contains more space than you once believed. For this reason, the appearance of a younger person in your path is sometimes more than a story about two individuals meeting. On a deeper level, it can signal that your psyche is opening a new stage of development. But how can you tell whether this is only a passing attraction or a form of connection truly different from anything you have experienced before? Part 3. Signs this love is unlike anything before. First, we need to say something very directly that Jung repeatedly warned about. Human beings often confuse meeting a real person with meeting an image created by their own mind. When someone enters your life at a moment when you are longing for something deeper, the psyche easily projects onto them everything that is still missing within you. You are not only seeing them, you are seeing your hopes, your wounds, and the parts of yourself that have not yet been lived. Jung called this phenomenon projection. He once wrote a striking line: "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The things that provoke strong reactions in us often point toward aspects of ourselves that remain unrecognized. In love, this becomes even more visible. Many people believe they have encountered destiny, but what they are often encountering is an unlived part of their own psyche reflected through another human being. For that reason, the first sign of a truly different kind of love is not that it sweeps you away like a storm. Relationships built on old wounds often keep the nervous system in a constant state of tension. You feel excited, but you also feel uneasy. You find yourself waiting for the other person's reaction, trying to interpret every signal. That feeling is easily mistaken for passion, but if you observe it more carefully, you may notice that it resembles vigilance more than connection. You are always trying to guess what the other person is thinking. You adjust your words so you will not push them away. You carry a subtle sense that the ground beneath you is unstable. A deeper connection often feels very different. Its sign is sometimes a quietness inside that you are not used to. The attraction is still there, but beneath that attraction, there is a sense of steadiness. When you are around this person, you realize that you do not need the heavy psychological armor you used to wear. You do not need to prepare a script for the conversation. You do not have to prove that you are interesting or good enough. You simply need to be present. This may sound simple, but for someone who has spent years in relationships that required constant emotional effort just to keep things working, that experience can feel almost unfamiliar. Jung described the capacity to recognize the deeper value of an experience as the feeling function. Many people assume that feeling simply means emotion. In Jungian psychology, however, it refers to a much deeper way of knowing what is aligned with your inner life. Some connections cannot be explained through logic alone. You cannot write a clear list of reasons proving why they are special. Yet you still sense a kind of inner rightness. Not because the relationship is perfect, but because within it, you are not required to betray yourself to stay. To make this clearer, let me share a story. I once heard about a woman named Laura. She was 42 when she met Ethan, a man nearly 10 years younger than her. Before that, Laura had been through 2 long relationships, and in both, she played the role of the stable woman. She was always the understanding one, the one who compromised, the one who kept things from becoming tense. When she met Ethan, what confused her was not the age difference. What confused her was something very small. In conversations with him, she noticed that she was speaking more honestly. One day, Ethan asked a simple question. "How do you actually feel today?" "Out of habit," Laura replied. "I'm fine." Then she paused and said again, "Actually, I feel a little sad today." Later, she said it was the first time in many years that she spoke honestly about her feelings without feeling the need to justify or apologize. Afterward, Laura said she understood that moment through Jung's idea of individuation, the process through which the psyche gradually brings a person back into contact with their authentic self. Stories like this often reveal something important. A love with depth not only brings you closer to another person, it also brings you closer to yourself. You begin to want to live more honestly. You speak more clearly about things you once kept inside your head. You no longer feel the need to perform strength all the time. You listen more carefully, not only to the other person, but also to your own feelings. These changes rarely come from advice or pressure. They emerge because the space within the relationship feels safe enough that you no longer need to pretend. What is interesting is that when such a connection appears, many people do not recognize it immediately. They are used to more dramatic forms of love. They believe love must be intense, filled with conflict, something that keeps them awake at night. But sometimes, something genuinely new arrives in a very different form. It is like living for years in a slightly suffocating room. When the window finally opens, you do not notice it at once. Only after a moment do you realize that you are breathing more deeply. And then you recognize how long you had grown accustomed to air that was too thin. Another sign of a meaningful connection in the Jungian sense is that it does not make you smaller. Instead, it encourages expansion in your life. You want to live more honestly. You want to be more truthful in your other relationships as well. You begin to re-examine habits you once accepted simply to keep the peace. This shift does not happen because the other person is influencing you directly. It feels more like an awakening. The other person simply becomes a mirror that shows you your life could be lived differently. And when you reflect on these signs, you may begin to ask yourself a very honest question. In the relationships you have experienced before, have you ever felt that kind of calm? Have you ever been with someone where you did not need to perform, guess, or defend yourself constantly? Or have you mostly been playing a certain role just to keep the relationship functioning? I am genuinely curious about your experience. What do you think is the clearest sign that love is different from the ones you have known before? If you have ever met someone who made you feel you could live more honestly, share your story in the comments. Sometimes, The most real stories from one person help someone else recognize what is happening in their own life. And there is something important to remember. When a love appears that awakens a more authentic part of you, it rarely brings only emotion. It also brings a challenge. To stay in a connection like that, you may have to face old fears, old beliefs, and even certain expectations from society. And that is exactly what we will explore in the next part. Part 4. How this connection can heal old wounds. When a kind of love appears that has the power to awaken the most authentic part of you, it rarely arrives carrying only emotion. It also sets something deeper in motion within the structure of your psyche. Many people think healing in love simply means feeling less lonely or receiving more care and attention. But from Jung's perspective, what is actually happening can be far more complex. A meaningful relationship sometimes touches very old layers of the psyche, layers that were formed long before a person even had the language to understand what was happening inside them. Many mature women carry within them a particular emotional structure. On the surface, they appear steady. They know how to care for others. They know how to keep relationships functioning. But beneath that surface lives a very old question. Am I too much? Am I too sensitive? Am I someone who eventually becomes too exhausting for others? These questions are rarely spoken aloud, yet they quietly shape how a person enters love. They love, but they keep part of themselves under control. They give a great deal, yet they struggle to believe they can truly be received in their entirety. Jung understood this pattern quite clearly. He believed that early life experiences often create what we might call emotional templates in the unconscious. When a child learns that suppressing their needs is necessary to maintain a connection with a caregiver, a psychological strategy slowly forms: love by restraining oneself. As that child grows older, the strategy continues to operate. That person may become highly responsible, deeply reliable, and emotionally mature. But in intimate relationships, they often carry a quiet fear that if they reveal their whole self, the other person may eventually leave. This is why, when a new connection appears, and it is truly safe, what begins to heal is not just present-day loneliness. What begins to shift is an entire system of emotional beliefs built over many years. And this process rarely happens through grand promises or dramatic gestures. It happens through small experiences that repeat over time. You say something honest, and the other person remains. You reveal a vulnerable part of yourself, and it is not dismissed. You express a need, and it is not treated as a burden. Experiences like these quietly begin to redraw the emotional map inside the psyche. Jung once wrote something very important. The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. When deep inner conflicts are worked through, they leave behind a form of stability that is difficult to shake. In a mature relationship, old wounds do not always disappear immediately. Instead, they are gradually brought into the light. And the simple fact that they can exist within closeness without being hidden or denied is what slowly begins the process of transformation. At this stage, something else often happens that many people do not expect. A new relationship not only reveals the beautiful parts of you, it also reveals your shadow. Jung used the word shadow to describe the parts of ourselves that we would rather not see. In love, the shadow can appear in many forms. It might be the fear of losing the other person. It might be a quiet insecurity about age when you are with someone younger. It might be shame about your body, or an old anger you believed you had already overcome. If a relationship lacks depth, these parts usually remain hidden, or are pushed away. But when the connection is real, they begin to surface. What makes such a relationship different is that you do not have to pretend these parts do not exist. You can see them without rejecting yourself. In Jungian psychology, this is the beginning of shadow integration. A person does not become whole by eliminating their darkness. They become whole by being able to see it clearly while still maintaining their sense of self-worth. I remember hearing a story about a woman named Claire. Claire was 47 when she began seeing Daniel, a man nearly 7 years younger than her. One evening, they were having dinner when Claire suddenly fell silent. Daniel asked what was wrong. After a moment, she said something very honest. "I just realized that part of me is afraid that one day you'll look at me and think I'm too old." Claire later said she would never have spoken those words in past relationships. But Daniel simply looked at her and said, "I don't need you to be younger. I need you to be you." When Claire reflected on that moment later, she said it helped her understand what Jung meant when he wrote that a deep relationship can become part of individuation. Not because Daniel solved her fear, but because for the first time she could speak it without feeling ashamed. What is important to notice in connections like this is that healing does not move in only one direction. You are not only receiving, you begin to realize that you can offer stability, listening, and emotional depth to another person without losing yourself in the process. You are no longer simply someone who survived past wounds. You become someone capable of transforming those experiences into wisdom. In the spirit of Jung, a meaningful relationship is not simply a reward life hands to you. It is often a phase within the process of individuation. Through the presence of the other person, you begin to rediscover parts of yourself that were left behind in earlier chapters of your life. Those parts may include vulnerability, sensitivity, or the ability to love without constant defense. When those parts return, you do not merely enter a new relationship. You begin to become a more integrated human being. But precisely because a connection like this can shake the older structures within the psyche, it often encounters strong resistance, both from the outside world and from within. Not everyone easily accepts a form of love that does not fit familiar patterns. And sometimes those very resistances are the reason people walk away from a relationship that could have transformed them in ways they never expected. Part 5. Barriers that could make you miss this love. Many people assume that the greatest obstacle to an unusual love lies in the circumstances, the difference in age, the opinion of family, or the gaze of society. These factors can certainly create real pressure, but in many cases, they are not what ultimately breaks a relationship. What more often destroys a deep connection lies in a far more hidden place: the unconscious structures that Jung called complexes. A complex is not a single thought. It is a whole cluster of memories, emotions, and reactions that have accumulated over time. When a complex is activated, people tend to react in familiar ways without realizing that they are repeating an old pattern. In love, one of the most common complexes is the feeling of not being enough. It may begin very early in life, when a person learns to doubt their own worth. As they grow older, that complex does not disappear. It simply changes its form. It makes a person doubt that someone's care will last. It keeps them quietly preparing for the moment when they might be left behind. For this reason, when a relationship with real depth appears, the first thing it touches is often not the romantic part of the psyche. It touches that complex. This explains a phenomenon that many people struggle to understand. Some women step into a relationship healthier than anything they have experienced before, yet instead of feeling safe, they begin to feel anxious. They wonder whether the other person will change. They analyze every small signal. Sometimes they even create distance before the relationship has a chance to grow deeper. This does not happen because they do not want love. It happens because their psyche has become more accustomed to defending itself than to receiving care. Jung once wrote very directly about this tendency. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Human beings are willing to do remarkably irrational things simply to avoid confronting their own inner life. When a love appears that has the power to change you, it forces you to face parts of yourself that you may have avoided for years. And many people unconsciously sabotage the relationship just to return to a psychological state that feels more familiar. Another powerful barrier is the social persona. The persona is the image we construct to function within a collective. It helps us be accepted, but it also makes us afraid to step outside established patterns. When a woman enters a relationship with someone younger, the persona can immediately begin to speak. It reminds her of how others may look at the situation. It recalls familiar expectations about age, roles, and what a relationship is supposed to look like. The difficulty is that the persona always speaks in the voice of reason. It persuades a person that abandoning a meaningful connection is the sensible choice. Yet very often, this is simply the psyche trying to avoid a profound change. What is equally interesting is that opposition from the outside does not always come from wisdom. Jung believed that people often project their shadow onto others. When someone witnesses a choice, they themselves are too afraid to live. They may react strongly. They call it advice, but in truth, they are protecting the psychological order that feels safe to them. Many people have walked away from relationships with real meaning, not because those relationships were wrong, but because they allowed the fears of others to define the direction of their own lives. Even if someone manages to move past social pressure, such a relationship still faces a deeper challenge: the difference between biological maturity and psychological maturity. Age is the most visible factor, but it does not determine the depth of a relationship. There are couples of the same age who remain trapped in immature dynamics, competition, control, or avoidance of honest conversation. On the other hand, there are relationships with a clear difference in years where two people are capable of speaking openly about emotions, boundaries, and responsibility. What determines whether a relationship can endure is not the number of years written on paper, but the capacity of two people to see themselves honestly. A meaningful love is not immune to conflict. Differences will still appear. Misunderstandings can still happen. The difference lies in how those moments are handled. In a relationship grounded in psychological maturity, conflict does not become a battlefield for old wounds. Instead, it becomes an opportunity for each person to understand themselves more clearly. When someone can say, "My reaction comes from my fear, not from something you have done," the relationship begins to move into an entirely different level of awareness. This is why Jung repeatedly emphasized that love cannot replace the inner development that each individual must undertake. A deep relationship may open the door to transformation, but it cannot rescue a person who insists on living entirely within the persona and refuses to look at their shadow. If someone is not willing to face their own complexes, they can eventually destroy any relationship, no matter how good it may be. So if a love with real meaning enters your life, respecting it does not mean idealizing it as something magical. Respecting it means becoming mature enough to recognize the unconscious forces within yourself that might stand in its way. Because sometimes the greatest danger to a relationship is not the resistance of the world, but the part of your own psyche that has grown accustomed to living in defense. And from here, we arrive at the final question of this entire journey. If a connection like this truly begins to enter your life, how do you recognize it clearly and protect it from being destroyed by the old unconscious patterns that once shaped you? That is exactly what we will explore in the final part. Part 6. Preparing your heart to receive it. Many people think that preparing for love simply means holding on to hope and waiting for the right person to appear. But in Jungian logic, what needs to be prepared is not waiting, but the capacity to face the truth about oneself. When a love with real depth appears, it often forces you to see parts of yourself that you were once able to avoid. You begin to recognize the ways you have loved out of fear. You see the moments when you made yourself smaller, just to keep a relationship alive. You also begin to notice the defenses that you once believed were simply part of your personality. This process is not comfortable, but it is exactly what Jung called individuation, the process through which a person gradually becomes a more whole and integrated individual. Jung once wrote something very important. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. A human being does not mature by imagining light, but by bringing awareness to the darkness within. This is perhaps more true in love than in any other area of life. A relationship with real depth will not only reflect the beautiful parts of you, it will also reflect the parts you have not yet reconciled. For that reason, the first preparation is not searching for the other person. It is looking directly at your own old patterns. A person may ask themselves very simple but very honest questions. What have I accepted in the past just to keep a relationship from ending? When did I remain silent in moments when I should have spoken the truth? What stories have I believed about my own worth? When these questions are asked seriously, the psyche begins to move. Patterns that once operated in the unconscious gradually become clearer. And once a pattern has been seen, it loses much of its power. Inner preparation also means rebuilding an inner center strong enough so that you do not turn another person into the center of your entire life. Jung repeatedly warned that when someone places the whole meaning of their life into a relationship, they unknowingly create a powerful projection. The other person is no longer seen as who they really are. They become a symbol for everything the psyche feels it lacks. This creates enormous pressure within the relationship and often leads to disappointment. A mature connection usually happens between two people who already have an inner life of their own. They do not meet in order to fill a void. They meet to share a journey that each of them has already begun walking. A simple way to understand this is to look at how you live when no one is beside you. If your presence with yourself always carries a feeling of emptiness, you will enter love with a deep need to be rescued. But if you have begun to build a meaningful life of your own, love appears as an expansion of that life. This does not make the relationship less important. On the contrary, it gives the relationship a stronger foundation because it is no longer forced to carry the entire weight of your psychological life. Inner preparation also involves recognizing the voices that exist within the psyche. Many of the voices in our minds are not truly our own. They are the voices of family, of culture, of standards that have been internalized for a long time. When someone begins writing down their deeper beliefs about love, age, the body, and their own worth, they are often surprised to realize how many of those beliefs do not actually belong to them. Jungian work sometimes begins with something very simple, observing these voices and asking one basic question: what is this voice trying to protect? Another part of preparation is continuing to live a life that still has a soul. Jung often emphasized that the psyche needs vitality to grow. This means continuing to nurture the parts of life that make you feel truly alive, caring for your body, maintaining meaningful friendships, following the things that awaken your curiosity. People who remain inwardly alive carry a very different kind of presence. They may have experienced pain, but they do not allow that pain to become their entire identity. And perhaps this is the most important point. If someone is truly walking toward you with a kind of love unlike anything you have known before, the best thing you can do is not to hold on to them through anxiety. The best thing you can do is become increasingly honest with yourself. Because in Jungian psychology, there is a very clear principle. What you encounter in the outer world can only remain in your life when there is an inner structure mature enough to contain it. When that happens, the meeting between two people no longer feels like a random miracle. It feels more like two currents that have been quietly forming in the unconscious for a long time, finally meeting at the right moment. And when that moment arrives, what you are experiencing is not only love. You are experiencing a step forward in the long journey of becoming who you truly are. What matters in this story is not the promise that life will send you a romantic reward. What matters is that sometimes a person's psyche reaches a level of maturity where it can no longer return to the kinds of connections it once accepted. When that happens, a meeting may appear as a quiet confirmation that your inner life has changed. It is not someone arriving to fill a lack in you. It is another human being entering at the right moment, revealing a deeper capacity for love that you did not yet have the conditions to live before. In that sense, the younger person in this story is not only a matter of age. They may carry a kind of psychological vitality that is still alive and in motion, an energy that allows the parts of you that have grown cautious after many years to begin breathing again. Jung often reminded us that what truly belongs to a person's process of growth rarely arrives as a reward of luck. It appears more like a piece that falls into place at the right moment in the journey of individuation. For that reason, the most important thing now is not trying to control when that love will appear. What matters is keeping your awareness clear enough, honest enough, and grounded in self-respect so that you can recognize it when it truly enters your life. And it is possible that what is moving toward you is not merely a relationship, but the first experience in your life that shows you what it means to be loved without having to shrink your soul. If these reflections have opened a new perspective for you on love and inner growth, leave a like so this video can reach more people who may be walking a similar path. And if you want to keep exploring the depth of the human psyche through the lens of Carl Jung, subscribe to the channel to join the next conversations.